Yeah. Just give me 1 minute.
I'm just like looking for him to see like, what are you doing? I know, I'm like, this is, it's awkward to deal with the live stream. It's like,
We'll behave for you, it's getting good.
Good evening to everyone in the audience. I know those are home watching us on the YouTube live stream and those that will watch this video or replay after this evening. I am Superintendent of Schools, Monica Merritt, and I welcome you. Thank you for coming this evening. I also want to give a special thanks to our panelists from New Hope and P-CCS Counseling. You'll hear from them shortly this evening. I definitely do not want to spend a lot of time talking tonight, but I definitely felt it was important for you to hear from me as we begin to tackle this and many other complex issues that our students and our staff are facing these days. I want you to know that mental health is very important to me personally, our Board of Education, and to all of our staff. Tonight, we will begin to engage in discussions around loss and grief, and we plan to bring you more information in the future about other related topics. This pandemic has really been difficult for everyone, but especially our students. And so I want to pledge to you this evening that we are going to do everything within our power to help our students, to help you as their families, to help our staff as we move together forward as a school community. So with that, I want to thank you again for coming this evening. I'd like to introduce our very special school psychologist, Ms. Kathy Grotis. She will get our program started tonight.
Good evening. I want to welcome each of you for coming together as a community during a year that has been one of social isolation through the global pandemic, trauma, loss, and grief. Our focus tonight is to support one another in this journey, going forward and focus on how we can invest in our children and in each other. We as a school district and as a community are striving to make mental health a more common discussion so our students, families, and community can feel comfortable talking about mental health. We see this as a positive step in our goal to crush the stigma and bring more awareness to mental health. And I would like to introduce our guest speakers. Matthew Swartz. Matt is the Director of Training and Development at P-CCS Counseling and P-CCS Global, where he leads teams of counselors and consultants in making a positive impact on our community. Matt works with leaders, schools, organizations, and cities to broaden their positive impact by providing them with a clear understanding of how to address mental health. He is a licensed clinical social worker and graduated with his master's from Columbia University in New York. Matt is considered an expert speaker on topics including anxiety, stress, traumatic grief, and loss to suicide. His work focuses on helping individuals and organizations to understand how to reduce pain, increase joy, build fulfilling lives, and strengthen communities. Our next guest speaker is Jennifer Fresh. Jennifer is the Executive Director of New Hope Center for Grief Support. New Hope Center is dedicated to bringing hope, healing, and new beginnings to adults and children grieving the death of a loved one. Jennifer and New Hope work with local organizations, schools, and those in the community to provide support in a time of crisis, along with training and education on the grief journey. Thank you both for being here tonight, along with the panelists, to help support our students, families, and community in finding hope and navigating through trauma, loss, and grief. Matt?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Kathy, for the introduction. My name is Matt Swartz, and I am a therapist and a speaker, as Kathy said. I'm here representing myself, but also very proud to be representing New Hope. New Hope is a grief support organization that's existed in our community for over 20 years that has helped grievers to find hope, healing, and new beginnings as they walk down the difficult journey of grief and loss. The presentation tonight is entitled Finding Hope, Navigating Grief, Trauma, and Loss. And I hope that by the end, everyone listening will be better equipped to address the traumas and the losses that occur in our lives and find a sense of hope in moving forward. So, as I said, New Hope is the Center for Grief Support that works in Northville and the surrounding communities to bring hope, healing, and new beginnings to adults and children grieving the death of a loved one. If you need support in working through your grief journey, we encourage you to call New Hope, reach out online. They're here to provide support. And Jennifer Fresh, the executive director, after my presentation concludes, will give you all more details and more information about New Hope and the services they offer. I have been proud to work with New Hope for the last 6 years. For a while, I conducted a loss to suicide group wherein we helped support people who had recently or after a long time lost loved ones to suicide. After I finished that group and handed it over, I now conduct trainings for their facilitators on a bi-monthly basis to help increase their ability to work with grievers. As Kathy mentioned, I am the director of training and development at P-CCS Counseling and P-CCS Global. On one side is our therapy, on the other side is our organizational consulting. And she said most of the stuff that's on here, so I don't need to repeat it. But I also want to share, my personal story. So the reason I'm up here is because when I was in high school, I dealt with the tragic loss of a dear friend of mine named Erin. We were at her birthday party one day and she went off to a mission trip the next week, and they found her in the restroom one night. She'd passed away. They still don't know what really happened, but dealing with that tragic loss, we were very lucky. Her church offered some grief counseling services, and me and our close group of friends came and processed through that loss. And it was an incredibly healing experience. And it taught me a lot about how to deal with these really tragic losses. I had no idea that I would grow up to do this work in schools, but it's one of those things where I feel like in this moment, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And I hope that the information I've collected on both my personal and professional journey will help you all navigate the challenges that you've experienced and the losses that this community has experienced recently. So our goals for today, by the time you leave, number one, I want to give you guys some education on traumatic grief. Okay, so number one, what is grief? And number two, what is traumatic grief and how is it different? And how do we deal with it? Because it seems a little different than what we might call a normal loss, right? The second is education on specifically loss to suicide. Why is suicide loss in of itself so traumatic? And how do we talk about it with each other? Most of us don't even have the language or information in order to engage in this topic because it is so taboo. And then finally, I want to give you guys a little dose of some education on mental health. I do a lot of these presentations, but I want to really focus on grief tonight, but a little snippet on, how can I understand my kids and my own mental health better? And what do I do about it? So let's talk about grief first. What is grief? Grief is the natural process of adjusting to a loss. We have to process the pain that comes with that loss. There's emotional pain, cognitive pain, and physical pain sometimes. Mainly, we're dealing with the impact of change. Change impacts our understanding of ourselves and of the world. And grief isn't just about death. Grief is about any type of loss. There's grief in a divorce. There's grief in, transition. The kids the first year of the pandemic who didn't get to go to their graduation. There's grief there in that loss. So it can be the loss of expectations, right? So grief is this all-encompassing idea in how we deal with loss. Okay. Now, what is mourning? You might have heard this word as well. So mourning is the act of actively working through the grief process, right? In community. We can't mourn alone. We mourn together. The research shows that a healthy process of grief includes mourning, right? In our society today, over the past 100 years, many of our mourning rituals have changed or stopped altogether. There's a lot of reasons. For instance, we used to wear black and walk around town, and people would, 100 years ago, people would come up to us and ask us what loss we'd experienced and sit with us and talk with us. We don't do that anymore. So, for instance, I've done these engagements before. I usually have a lot more people in the audience, right? But right now, a lot of you are at home, watching on the YouTubes. So we can't mourn together, especially in the middle of the pandemic. And that's really challenging too. So we really lean in New Hope on the value of support groups. Support groups are the context through which we can actively engage in that healthy mourning process by talking with peers who have dealt with these tragic losses before, who can help guide us through that journey based on their personal experience. And then on top of it all, we face some challenges with stigma, right? Why are you in pain? Why aren't you better yet? The plain fact is that I think our culture does a really crummy job dealing with death. We have a very poor understanding of how humans process loss and grief over time. So I'm hoping to correct some of that today. So we've got grief, we've got the process of working through grief and mourning, and now I want to talk about traumatic grief, okay? Traumatic grief describes the grieving experience of one who has lost a loved one in a very traumatic way. So that might be suicide, or it might be overdose, or it might be violence, a methodology of loss that is abnormal or particularly painful. Or that person is traumatized due to the loss. It could be a significant loss, maybe of a child, maybe of a parent, right? A child who's young losing a parent, right? It could be the specific nature of the loss. It could be unexpected, right? Or there could be already existing mental health or trauma issues. If I already have PTSD, if I already have depression, the dealing with a loss of any kind can become traumatic because my brain isn't able to effectively process. So in this case, what's true is the grief is going to be more challenging. It's going to be more emotional. It's going to be more extreme than what we might know as normal, healthy grief, right? And as a clinician, as a therapist, I measure this through sort of three ways. Number one is frequency. How often are you dealing with this grief or these lost thoughts, feelings, emotions, right? How intense is it? How big is it? How powerful is it? And duration, how long does it last? And that's how we kind of judge, is this traumatic grief or not? Another final kind of introduction of term here is, what is complicated grief? Okay, so complicated grief describes a grief process that does not resolve in a healthy time period. Kind of rule of thumb for regular grief is we expect about 6 months to a year is kind of a standard grieving process. So people who experience traumatic grief, we find most of the time they don't grieve in that normal timeline. And they have to work through this longer timeline. And that's how we know it's complicated grief, right? Most individuals that are grieving suicide loss directly will experience complicated grief, which is to say, if you knew the person, if you're a parent, if you were directly engaged and involved in this loss, the grief is likely going to become complicated because of the nature of that trauma. While those experiences, indirect grief, will not. So say you're the friend of the friend, right? And you're supporting your friend who lost this person, and you had some grief symptoms, but now it's 6 months or 9 months in and you're kind of better, but your friend, it seems like it just happened yesterday and you're confused and you don't understand. Well, their grief is complicated and yours is not. And that's part of why it can be so challenging. So this, of course, adds additional complications to the process of mourning, right? Others expect timeline to go faster. Meanwhile, you are in this trauma, complicated grief spiral. It's not going as fast as anybody might want. And so we can often support will drop off. The mourning experience will drop off earlier than is necessarily. So again, that's where I refer people to peer support groups that can help continue that healthy grief and mourning process. So I want to break this down for you guys. There are different models of grief. I like this one particularly well. This is what I would call the natural grief process. So this describes how somebody would naturally work through grief in their life, okay? The first stage is what we call hope. So hope is all about adjusting to the shock of the loss, right? Here's the deal. Your brain is really good at figuring out how much pain it can process. And when big tidal wave of pain is coming at you, it's going to put up a dam to prevent too much information from coming in so that you can process it a little bit at a time, okay? And that's that shock process. Often we see people who are dealing with a loss initially, they seem numb. They seem cut off. They seem, they'll describe it as everything is fuzzy, or they're not really recording things, or they feel like they're outside of themselves, right? That's the shock process. Why do we do this? Well, it's our body and our brain's job to help us maintain survival first and foremost. I got to go to work. I got to make money. I got to make sure my kids are fed. I got to figure out how to go through the motions of daily life. So that shock protects us while we work to adjust to our experience, right? And maintain survival. In order to move past that stage, we have to establish a sense of safety. Now, I don't mean safety like somebody's going to come into your house and smack you, right? I mean safety like an internal physiological sense of safety. We're going to talk a little more about how that works in the body today. So I'll explain that more in a little bit, but basically what it means is regulating our body in such a way that internally and subconsciously we feel safe. In other words, we don't feel like we're in pain, or at least enough pain that we can begin to move into the healing process. So then comes the second stage. It's that healing stage. In this healing stage, we need to find belonging. Belonging means that it's okay to be who you are and where you're at. In other words, the pain you're in right now is okay, and it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to share it. It's okay to process through it. It can be really hard when somebody's in a traumatic grief process to find a place where they can find that belonging. Again, I'll keep saying it. That's why I defer to peer support groups like New Hope in order to help people find belonging in their loss. The goal of this is to begin to process through emotions within that context of belonging. And what that means is we need to feel through the anger, the sadness, the shame, the guilt, right? All of those complex, the fear, the sadness, all the complex emotions that come up with grief and loss. Again, whether it's a sort of standard grief process or a traumatic grief process, either way, we're going to need to process through those emotions. Okay. Here's where it gets tricky. In traumatic or complicated grief, we're going to hit what you might call trauma loops or emotion loops. And what that's going to look like on the outside is you get stuck looping in the same emotion again and again. I work with a lot of parents who have lost loved ones, kids to suicide, right? And they're going to get caught almost all the time in a shame spiral, which is it's all my fault. It's all my fault. It's all my fault. And they just get stuck there. And what's happening is this traumatic grief process is playing upon unaddressed, repressed emotions from the past. In other words, you already felt guilty as a person. You already took on too much responsibility yourself. And now you've lost your child, so of course it's your fault. So it doesn't come out of nowhere. But people don't suddenly become angry. You were angry before, and now it's worse, right? And so when you hit one of these trauma loops, the honest truth is that's the time where you need to seek out additional support. You need to find a professional. Ideally, a professional who specializes in traumatic loss, like I do. There are other professionals in the community who specialize in suicide loss, specifically trauma loss, trauma in general. These experts have particular knowledge to help us work through these really difficult emotions. And there are many times where people come to New Hope's groups and they get stuck in some of these trauma loops. And that's when New Hope will lovingly refer them to additional care while they continue that mourning process within the context of the groups. Okay. So as we work through these difficult emotions, the ones from the present and the unaddressed stuff from the past. So the key underline here, grief is going to bring up your unaddressed BS. And that's what is going to make it the most complicated. That's the stuff you never wanted to deal with. Now you have to deal with it if you want to move forward. Otherwise, you're going to be caught in this grief spiral for a very, 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 very long time. So as we begin to address those emotions, heal the pain of the present and the past, we begin to move into the third stage, which we'll call integration. Integration is we begin to accept the loss. So I want to be clear what I mean when I say acceptance. I don't mean this loss is good. I just mean the acknowledgement that this loss occurred. And I want to be clear, acceptance is not one moment. Okay. Those who have lost somebody traumatically wake up every morning and have to readjust to the loss, have to get out of bed every morning and go, this person is gone. The foundation of my life is gone in the case of a parent or a child, right? This acceptance takes place over a long period of time, over repeated interactions. But every time the big emotion comes up and gets in the way, we can't work on the acceptance until we address the emotions that are blocking us. So emotion comes first, then we can work on the acceptance. We can begin jumping into our cognitive brain and exploring the meaning of the loss, asking the big questions. Why does death work the way it works? Why do people die? Why did we lose this person? What do I do about it? What's the meaning of this loss going forward? It causes us to have to adjust our paradigm. Many people spend their lives pushing away the reality of death, pushing away the reality of traumatic loss. One of the things that I really encourage my patients to do is grieve ahead, knowing that no matter what, you will lose people in your life. There will be loss, there will be pain, but most of us push it away until the moment of trauma. Now we have to adjust our paradigm. Now we have to begin to include death, include loss in our picture of the world, rather than navigate the world trying to avoid it or control it. That's a whole rabbit hole. As we begin to adjust our paradigm, we can move into this fourth and final stage of grief, which we'll call new beginnings. New beginnings is when we begin to adjust and find identity within the loss, right? So I am now somebody who lost this person. This is part of who I am. This is part of what I have to deal with. This is part of what my life has become, right? And in that, rather than pushing it away, we can begin to find purpose, right? There are a large group of people here today that have found purpose within the pain of their loss. And what they do is they take their pain and their healing and they bring it to others so they can invite others into that healing journey. And that's discovering that sense of purpose. Now, that doesn't happen out of the gate. You can't lose somebody 2 months and 2 months later be healing other people. That's not how it works. You got to go through your junk. And even when you're in that new beginning stage, you still tip back and forth, right, guys? Back into your junk. So the healing process is ongoing. But the purpose is, even though I'm imperfect, even though I'm broken, even though I'm still in pain, I am moving forward. I'm helping other people to move forward as well, right? And that's when we begin to take our pain and help it to impact others. And that's part of why I'm here. I'm here capturing the pain and the process of healing that came from it in order to bring healing to other people. So this is our natural grief process. So let's talk a little bit specifically about suicide. So here are some facts and data. Every 28 seconds, somebody attempts suicide. And that means there's 1.1 million attempts per year in the United States, not globally, in the United States. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for people aged 15 to 24, and the 10th leading cause overall. So what that means is we know especially young populations are very vulnerable to suicide. We've also seen a 30% increase in the past 16 years. And just so you can get a sense, because 30 sounds like a big number, the statistics are a movement from 10.4 out of 100,000 to 13.5 out of 100,000. You can make statistics look however you want them to look, but it is an increase. And it's worth noting that there is a problem, and it's probably systemic. Now, that being said, it's fair to note that suicide rates today are similar to those in the 70s and the 80s. So it got better, and then it got worse again. And it's worth asking questions like, why is that the case? What's going on? What's the systemic issue here? You know, there's a lot of factors. There's individual health factors. There's environmental factors like social media. There's historical factors like family history, family trauma. There's never just one thing. Somebody that ends up in a traumatic or painful mental health position or attempting suicide, it's not one magic thing, as much as we would like it to be. So what makes suicide different? What makes dealing with suicide loss different? Well, number one, we can't prepare for it. Most of the time we don't get warning. The 1980s, TV shows and movies where everybody leaves a suicide note or there's all these signs, the people I work with, most of the time, there weren't a lot of signs. They didn't, and it wasn't that they were stupid or they didn't understand. It's genuinely that in the same way that sometimes there aren't signs before a heart attack. This is a physiological issue. There's not a huge difference between having a brain attack and having a heart attack. We treat them very differently, and we'll get into that a little, right? Because we don't understand it, right? That's the second thing. So it scares us, and fear interrupts our healthy grief process. We ask, oh my God, what if somebody I know and love also takes their life? How can we stop it? What does this mean? Why is this happening, right? Why did it happen? Could it happen again? Is it my fault? All of these very confusing questions. And so we end up reacting based on our emotions and our pain, rather than reacting based on how other people, what they might need in order to grieve in a healthy way, right? One of the big factors is this large societal stigma, okay? We're not taught how to deal with suicide loss, how to talk about it, or how to heal through it. We view it through this moral lens. You made a choice. It's a bad choice. You hurt other people, right? I love them, but they did something wrong. And, we can go down the rabbit hole, and I can't go too deep today, but I do want to leave you with the idea that as an expert dealing with this field, I do not believe that it's quick and easy to say that suicide is a choice. In the same way, I think it would be wrong to say having a heart attack is a choice. So that's, again, a complicated discussion worth exploring. And some of the questions you guys asked, we'll get a little into that. So I want to talk a little about, though, what the brain looks like in the moment of loss. Okay, so what happens is this part of your brain in the back called the hindbrain that deals with survival and fight or flight mechanisms. It takes over and it shuts off the other systems in your brain, the logical systems, the emotional systems, the part of you that would go, oh, I don't want to hurt the people I love, or the part of you that would go, this is just a temporary problem. I can fix this. I can solve this. Those systems in your brain shut down. And the only part of your brain that's really still around is this biological part of your brain that basically the message is you are the cause of your own pain, or the pain is too great. We have to stop it now. And so that complicated messaging gets oversimplified and turns into this hindbrain dysregulation. Again, I view it as a biological issue, not a moral one. I view it like a heart attack. It's a brain attack. Right? By the time the brain reaches this point, there's very few interventions that are often successful. And so the work really to be done is the work way ahead of time, not in that moment. Because in that moment, the brain is in this space of deep failure. Again, biologically, right? Not morally. There's a tremendous impact when it comes to suicide loss on family and loved ones, right? We have to balance economics with emotions. The reality is you should take 6 months off from work. Right? That'd be great. Not here. We have to grieve first, and then we can repair our lives. But so many of us jump to trying to repair everything immediately, right? The truth is that the one good thing about these kinds of traumatic losses is that we're called to begin to make emotional health a priority, because there's really no other alternative. And oftentimes for people who've dealt with traumatic grief, these experiences can catapult them into the deeper healing that needs to take place in their lives. The truth is, and again, this is a longer discussion, we have to reconcile with the culture that we've created. We've created a culture that cares more about productivity than it cares about our emotional experience. And the reality is our emotional experience is the center of our world. So some things are going to need to change culturally, globally, if we want to address this issue. But of course, I don't have the power to do that. I want you to feel hopeful. And what it means is it starts with us. It starts with our own individual healing journey. If we want to change a culture, we have to change. And what that means is if you want your children to be healthier, you need to be healthier. If you haven't gone to therapy, don't go putting your kids in therapy. Well, I mean, that's not true. Put your kids in therapy. And you need to go to therapy. We need to go to therapy, right? We need to understand the things that we don't know, we can't see. They're invisible to us if we're going to be able to have effective conversations with our children around mental health. So how can I talk about suicide loss with my loved ones, especially with kids? Okay. Always honesty. We do not lie. We do not hide the truth. We are honest. Hiding will always lead to more problems down the road. I don't care how young your child is. Hiding the truth from them will create disturbance in your relationship, and it will also create disturbance in their ability to healthfully process through grief, okay? We have to be vulnerable. The reason we don't want to talk to our kids about it is because it makes us feel uncomfortable. We don't know how to deal with those emotions. We don't want our kids to feel bad, right? We have to work through that challenge. The good news is we can provide information relative to a child's age. right? So for instance, I have a 2.5-year-old. We just lost our cat, right? So what I say to my 2.5-year-old is I say, Arlo got sick and he died. And that means he's not going to be back with us. And every so often, my 2.5-year-old will bring up Arlo and say, I miss Arlo. I'll say, I know. I miss Arlo too. And it's really sad. Sometimes we get sick and sometimes we die. And we have that moment together and we feel that. Right? So if I'm trying to explain to a young child, a 6-year-old, say, somebody who committed suicide, somebody who took their life, I'm sorry, I might say something like their brain got sick. Right? You know how sometimes your tummy gets really sick? You know how sometimes, a heart can get really sick, right? Their brain got really sick, right? If I'm talking to an older child, maybe a middle schooler or a high schooler, I might say something like they were unable to understand that things could get better. Their brain told them there was no way out of the pain, right? Now, again, I'm going to defer to individual situations and experts, right? Don't let me tell you how to talk to your children about a particular traumatic loss. Go to an expert, give them details about the situation. They will give you more specific feedback on how to address the issue. But the important points here are we have to change the information based on their age, but always, always honesty. And then continued open communication. You don't have to bring it up a million times. If it matters to them, they'll bring it up. Answer their questions honestly. As they get older, they'll ask more and more questions, deeper and deeper questions. As they ask those questions, do your best to honestly answer what they present to you. So now I want to shift a little and I want to talk about trauma. Okay, what is trauma? Trauma is the brain's perception of pain beyond its ability to healthfully process. In other words, if I can eat a bowl of rice and somebody gives me 3 bowls of rice, that's too much rice for my body to process, right? It's too much pain for my body to process. I got 3 bowls of pain and I can only process 1. When this occurs, our brain is going to jump into natural protective mechanisms to shield us from the immediate impact of the trauma so that we can more healthfully process it over time. In other words, it says, okay, you got 3 bowls of rice. We'll eat a half now and a half later and a half later and a half later and a half later and a half later. And eventually I'll have eaten 3 bowls of rice, but I can't do it all at once. Trauma is often sudden and unexpected, right? The more unexpected the pain, the bigger it's going to be. The key in trauma is that past pain or existing trauma is unresolved and it shifts the perception of our new trauma. In other words, when I have unaddressed pain from the past, it's more likely that new painful things are going to be difficult for me. In other words, if I was already depressed and then somebody takes their life, that's going to be more traumatic to me than it would be if I wasn't already depressed, right? So in other words, past pain becomes exponential in our ability to process through it. Okay, so here's how this works. I want to give you a little map. Okay, this is how our I call this the nervous system scale, physiological response to change, which is basically how does your body deal with change? Okay, it starts with arousal, right? Maybe there's a noise in your environment. There's something's waking you up, something's arousing your nervous system and causing you to take interest in it. Okay, then too much arousal begins to create stress. So say if there's 1 TV on, I can deal with that. But say somebody starts to turn on 2, 3, 4 TVs in the same room, it's going to start to get stressful. I can't deal with all that stimuli at once. Okay, as that stress builds and that stress builds and that stress builds, it becomes pain, right? There's 10 TVs on and I go, I literally can't handle this anymore, right? So then pain, as it adds up in our nervous system, it can become an injury. I often, like if I have a little branch or a twig, I'll take that twig and I'll bend it. You can bend it to a certain point and then eventually snap, right? You can hold your hand on a hot stove a little bit, but then after a couple seconds, it begins to burn, right? And so we can tolerate certain negative things happening, but when it happens again and again, or it's super big, it becomes an emotional injury, right? So maybe I stand up and give a talk in my 4th grade class and everybody laughs at me and that becomes an injury. And now it's going to produce fear. I don't want to stand up and give another presentation in the future because they're going to laugh at me, right? So that injury becomes fear for good reason. If something hurts me, I want to prevent myself from doing it again, right? If I touch a hot stove, I want to learn to prevent myself from doing that again, right? But that begins to create fear. Now, if that fear is not healthfully addressed, right? Oh, don't touch, look at the knobs. If the knobs are on, don't touch the stove. If the knobs aren't on, you can touch the stove, right? Check. But if I don't know how to deal with that fear, if I haven't rationalized that pain can start to add up, and it becomes anxiety. Anxiety is fear of fear, right? This negative experience keeps coming up. I don't know how to deal with it. Now I'm pushing it away and preventing it because I don't know how to deal with it, right? So that anxiety adds up, and that begins to become trauma. And that trauma is, again, more pain than I can process. And so then I could take you down the rabbit hole in terms of if I can't process through that anxiety and trauma, I might become depressed. I might become dissociated. There are a lot of different ways in which that can manifest, but this is how it adds up over time. Basically, our brains and our bodies were built to deal with acute pain, right? Tiger coming at me, run. But when I wake up every day and social media is yelling at me and social media is yelling at me and social media is yelling at me, right? We don't know how to compute that chronic pain, and it begins to create injury in our body. Okay. So I told you I'd talk about safety. I want to talk about safety. So the idea, there's this model called the polyvagal theory. You don't need to worry about it, but it talks about something called arousal in the window of tolerance. The idea is we have this happy, safe, doable space called the window of tolerance where we're regulated and we feel safe. Now, the more pain we deal with in our lives that goes unprocessed, the more that window of tolerance is going to shrink. There's going to be a smaller and smaller and smaller window where we can stay safe and regulated. And then what happens is if something dysregulates us or causes us pain, first and foremost, it's going to kick us up into what we call hyperarousal, fight or flight, right? I'm either going to run or I'm going to try to fix it. And oftentimes, if we go up and it works, we come back down and it's okay. But if we go up and it doesn't work, we might end up ping-ponging back and forth, fight and flight, fight and flight, fight and flight, fight and flight. Eventually, your nervous system is going to get exhausted, right? So for instance, if I deal with a traumatic loss, there's nothing I can do to fix it. I can't fight it because it already happened. I can't run from it because the pain's encoded in my body. So now I'm going fight or flight, fight or flight, fight or flight, fight or flight. What happens is I end up dropping down the sides, down into what we call hypo or under arousal. And this is the shutdown, the freeze response, depression, right? Dissociation. This is where I shut down or I numb out, okay? Now, if I habituate, which is if I practice this response of going downward, I can start to move directly from that window of tolerance down into the freeze response after a while. Right? So the idea is I want to be able to heal the pain that's trapped in my nervous system so I can widen this window of tolerance over time and increase my emotional regulation skill sets. How do I deal with emotions so that I can get out of the hyper and the hypoarousal back into the window of tolerance more easily? This is an art. This is a science. This is what people go to therapy for. This is what people do trauma work for. But it's totally possible to widen your window of tolerance. I've done it. Used to have a really small one. I have a much larger one. Used to end up in hyperarousal all the time, always agitated, always trying to fix everything. The more therapy I've done, the more good work I've done, the more I've been able to get out of that zone and come back to the window of tolerance, right? Right now, you can probably see, wow, that guy's way calmer than he should be giving this talk, this presentation, right? I am in my window of tolerance, and I practiced that. That didn't come out of nowhere. So how does this pain add up in our body to become an injury? Well, it's nature and it's nurture. So it starts with genetics, right? Genetics defines the possibility. Some of us are more vulnerable to emotions than other people. And it's just in the genetics, right? But genetics isn't certainty, it's options. Think of genetics like a cookbook, right? There's like 50 different recipes inside that cookbook. It doesn't mean every single recipe is going to get cooked. Depends on our experience. So the next part is, the really dramatic part is early childhood. The early childhood development between the ages of 0 and 5 are going to determine those main recipes that get cooked, right? Did I have a loving, attentive caregiver that taught me how to regulate my emotions? It's going to be much easier down the line. Did I have a caregiver who was potentially abusive or more usually benign neglect, which is, I'm sorry, I'm too busy dealing with my BS to deal with yours? Right? That's usually more what happens. It's going to decrease our ability to emotionally regulate as children and adults. Okay. Then on top of that early childhood experience, we're going to add traumas, right? Really difficult negative events in your life. If you lose a caregiver, something really bad happens in your life, that's going to create pain and add damage and injury inside your nervous system. Okay. Then on top of that is repeated events. So I had this really crummy job back in New York. It would be one thing if just one day I came in and my boss was yucky at me. But when you come in every day for a year and a half and your boss is yucky at you every single day, right? That repeated event can become traumatic. In that case, I had some panic attacks. That was how that manifested for me. But those repeated negative events, right? That begins to pile up. And then on top of that, we add the daily stress, right? So if I think about it like filling a cup say we got a water bottle, right? As I begin to fill this cup, and now it's all the way up to the brim, if I try to add daily stress on top of it, it's going to overflow. And that's the case of people who are carrying around a lot of emotional injury or a lot of trauma. Okay. Now, quick snapshot of how this works in the brain. I had mentioned that that hindbrain, right? In this gray area in the brain, this is the part that regulates fight or flight, body regulation, survival, and safety. This is the part that we're going to have to heal in order to begin finding the hope we're looking for in this traumatic grief process. Then in that green area, it's called the limbic system. This is the part of your brain that deals with emotions, feelings, memories, and reactions. In order to heal this part of the brain, this is when we begin to move into that emotional healing process. Okay. Then in that neocortex, this is where our thoughts, beliefs, our autopilots, our expectations, and our habits are stored. This is where, as we begin to heal this area of our brain, we move into integration, right? That logical process. And then finally, in the front of our brain, in our prefrontal cortex, is where awareness, focus, imagination, choice, and creation are stored. This is where we begin to move into new beginnings. Now, here's the bad news. We live about 10% or less of our day in the prefrontal cortex. Right. So most of the time, other areas of our brain are more in charge. And the worst news is that when the gray area of the brain lights up, it shuts off the higher areas of the brain. When the green area lights up, it shuts off the red and the blue. So it's so easy to get pulled out of those really healthy areas of our brain, especially if we have trauma. The more traumatized or injured the gray or the green portions of the brain are, the more we're going to be sucked out. And we've all been there. I end up getting in an angry fight with a child or a friend, right, for no good reason. Well, the green part of your brain, it lit up, it took over, and now we're in a stupid argument we don't want to be in. So we've all been there, but it's especially important to understand in the course of trauma and grief. Okay. So I'm just going to go a couple more minutes, and I want to talk about some trauma patterns, right? How do we know somebody's in a trauma loop? What does that look like? Okay. Well, there are kind of some codes that I look for. So number one is a lasting feeling of powerlessness. When people express things like, I don't know what to do, there's no way to solve this, I'm stuck, right? Powerlessness is a sign that we're trapped in trauma, okay? Another sign that we might look for is somebody having a perpetual feeling of loneliness or aloneness, even when they're around other people. Something else we might look for is somebody who feels consistently unsafe, right? They express, perhaps what we might call paranoia or anxiety, even in what we might perceive to be normal situations. In addition to that, somebody who's feeling both unsafe and powerless at the same time, they're going to feel trapped, right? Maybe I feel trapped in my job or trapped in my relationships, right? Then somebody who's feeling both powerless and alone is going to feel responsible. This is the person who says, it's all my fault, I need to fix it, I need to do something better, right? This in itself can be a trauma response. I used to go into this mode, I'm a professional, I need to fix it, I need to make everybody feel better. Well, here I am, I can offer you information, I can help you, but I can't fix it for you. I'm not responsible for your pain, though I can certainly be helpful. And then if somebody's both unsafe and alone, we're going to experience distrust. I don't feel like I can trust other people or situations or the world, right? Now, if I'm feeling all of those things at the same time, powerless, alone, and unsafe, I'm going to become empty or hopeless, right? Depression by any other name. Okay. What can I do? Well, there's steps we can take to resolve trauma. So very simply, if I'm feeling powerless, I need to be able to make small choices. Okay. If your child is grieving a traumatic loss and they need to take a day off of school, let them. They need to take a couple days off of school, let them. Empowering them with that choice is going to help them resolve the pain and the trauma inside their nervous systems. Don't let them never go back to school, but there's a middle ground, right? Somebody who's feeling alone, you want to help them find belonging, right? You want to help them find a group of people that can understand. So again, I'm going to defer back to New Hope and I'm going to defer back to peer support programs. Can I find somebody like a teen group or a young adult group where they've experienced that same kind of loss, okay? And then if I'm feeling unsafe, I'm going to need stability. I'm going to need routines. I'm going to need consistency. I'm going to need things that I can expect. Okay. Now, if I feel responsible, I need some collaboration, right? Let's partner with people that can help, right? A therapist, a mentor, somebody, right? If I'm experiencing distrust, I want to find places where I can trust, small moments of trust that can add up over time. And then if I'm feeling trapped, we want to give them some autonomy to make decisions, go different places, right? So again, there's an art to this, but I just want to highlight and give you guys some hope. There are things we can do. Now, the question always comes, and if I can work on all three of these things, stability, belonging, and choice, I can begin to feel more whole and find healing. Okay. Now, people always ask me, what are some signs that my child is suffering with some mental health issues? Okay, so let's talk about emotions first and foremost. Okay, emotions are healthy. Emotions are important. It's when we don't learn how to healthily identify, communicate, and process through our emotions that we get into trauma and trouble. So anger is healthy. What's not healthy is responding to your anger automatically or not processing through it. When we don't process through our anger, it becomes blame. Okay. If you have a child or a loved one or a friend who's consistently blaming the outside world for their pain, that's a really good sign that they're in a trauma pattern and they need some help. Okay. Now, guilt is another really important emotion. So again, guilt is natural and healthy, right? We're tribal creatures. And if I do something that hurts you, it makes sense I'd feel guilty. And then I need to do something about it to repair, right? Guilt is repaired in connection. But if I don't work through that guilt, I don't find connection to process through it, whether it's the person I hurt or my best friend to help me talk through it or a parent, right? Then it's going to become shame. Guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad, right? So somebody who's walking around with a feeling of shame, of wrongness, of badness, it's a really good sign that they're in a trauma loop and they need some help. Okay? And then, of course, there's sadness. Again, sadness is healthy. Teach your kids to cry. Cry with your kids. Express healthy emotions. Okay? If we don't, we store it away in our body and it becomes despair, hopelessness, depression, right? So helping our children to work through these emotions, we're going to have to learn to work through these emotions. If we don't know how, we have to go to therapy. If we have unaddressed anger, guilt, sadness, if we have crystallized blame, shame, despair, we need to get help. We need to work through that. Your kids can only rise to the level of emotional health that you have attained until they leave your house. So we want to do that work so we can help our kids. Okay. Now, what about behavior? What am I looking for? Right. So controlling behavior that comes out of anger or aggression. Right. If I have a child who's constantly trying to control the outside world, that may be a really good sign that they might need some help. Okay. Now, people pleasing. Right. So these are the ones that get overlooked. High achieving kids that make everybody happy, that never cause a problem. They're quiet in class. These are the ones suffering silently in pain. If your child is constantly trying to make everybody else happy, but can't answer questions like, what do you do for fun? What feels good to you? What are you doing in your life right now that's meaningful to you? That's a good sign they're caught in this people-pleasing guilt trap, and they may need some therapy, right? And then finally, avoidance. A child who's constantly avoiding any pain, you can't just push them through it. Their nervous system is avoiding that pain because it's too painful. We have to equip them with the skills and the tools to address the emotional pain that they're carrying around with them in their body. Okay, these are all really good reasons to say, hey, we should go to therapy. We should work on some of this stuff together. Okay, final thoughts. How do we deal with stress and pain? Okay, most of us deal with stress and pain through distracting. I'm going to suppress, internalize, compartmentalize, store that pain in my body. Why do we do this? It's often the best we've been taught. These are our survival instincts. This is what we do. Now, it works a certain amount short term, but in long term, it's going to become a negative, self-destructive pattern, right? There's nothing wrong with an episode of Netflix, but when I'm watching 7, 8, 9 episodes of Netflix to hide from the world, right now it's a problem. Okay, so if you go to therapy, you do some work or read some books, it's going to try to yank you into coping. Okay, coping is learning to soothe in the moment and manage the stress. Okay, how do I implement self-care coping skills to improve the present moment? And how do I attempt cognitive restructuring to change the way I'm thinking and what I believe about the world to have more positive, helpful interpretations? Okay, sorry. Most people get caught on coping. Coping's great, but you want to be able to eventually move to the next step. And the next step is healing. Healing is, how do I not just manage the pain, but how do I release the pain and strengthen my nervous system over time, right? Well, that's, say you go to therapy, your therapist is going to teach you to attend to your pain with loving attention in order to release it from your body in a healthy way. Then as time goes on, you might learn how to begin to explore your past pain in order to provide loving attention to release it. First, we have to work on the present stuff. First, for instance, we have to grieve and deal with the trauma right in front of us. Then we can begin to dig into the past stuff. Okay. And then eventually we're going to begin to learn skills even more deeply. We might call these evolving, where we learn to convert stress and pain into creative energy. We might change how we acquire stimuli, decrease the stimuli we're acquiring, and increase our ability to process it. And then change how we're interpreting meaning, how we're interpreting that stimuli. That's all deep work. I'm not here to get into that today, but I just want to show you guys that evolution. So if you look at this and you go, yeah, mostly I'm distracting, you might need to gain some coping skills. If you recognize, actually, I'm coping, well, great. Now it's time to move into healing, right? We want to move forward on that journey. So there's a lot of resources I want to give you guys. I want to transition into the next part here. So there's a bit link here, a small link, bit.ly/suicide-loss. This is my repository of suicide and traumatic grief related content. I know Jen with New Hope also has her own set of content as well. You can always reach out to New Hope. You can reach out to P-CCS Counseling, which is my therapy practice. We have 20 different amazing practitioners that work with kids, adults, all across the board. And New Hope also has other referral sources. Reset Brain and Body in Plymouth is fantastic. Hygera Health, which is a community mental health organization, is fantastic. There are tons of other places as well. I don't care where you go. I just want you to do the work. I want you to feel happy and healthy. I want you to work through your pain so that you can live a less painful and more joyful life. Jen, did you want to come take over? So I'm now going to introduce the Executive Director of New Hope Center for Grief Support, Jennifer Fresh, who will be leading the next portion of our programming and introducing our panel from New Hope.
Thank you, Matt. He is amazing. And if you're not thinking as a parent right now, I got a lot of stuff to work through, he did his job. That's exactly what it is. It's not just a school issue. It is not just a home issue. It is not just the community issue. Loss and grieving is unique. It is something we are all going to go through. Grieving is a process. It is normal. It is natural, and it is necessary to move forward and to find healing and hope and new beginnings. So a little bit about New Hope Center for Grief Support. We are a 501(c) nonprofit located in downtown Northville. We service the whole metropolitan area. Right now, we are offering opportunities to get connected in peer support groups online, virtually. Next month, we will be segueing back into in-person groups, but we'll still have online options. We found them highly successful for particular demographics like our teen group. So we are a free resource to the community. So if you have been impacted by the death of a loved one, or your children, or a family member, or a neighbor, please give them our information or simply our name. They can look us up on the web. Our phone number is listed here tonight. But we provide ongoing support groups for specific loss. So whether if you've lost a spouse, a child, a family member, someone to suicide, overdose, or addiction, we have various groups that support the specific loss. The organization has been around for 21 years, and our mission is to bring hope, healing, and new beginnings to children, families, and adults that have been impacted by loss. So the individual, Kathy Clow, founded New Hope 21 years ago. Kathy was the Arbor Hospice Director and unfortunately found herself a widow unexpectedly, lost her husband at a young age, and she had 3 young children. At that time, she identified there was nothing in our community to support grief and loss, her family. So she started New Hope, and it has flourished. Today, we service over 5,000 individuals through ongoing support groups, programs, and services. Most importantly, it's free of charge. For individuals, families seeking out support, there's no cost, and we welcome everyone. Here's a small list of what we do. There's kids camps, there's teen groups, loss-specific groups, there's seminars on beginning in the grief journey, so you better understand loss, and then how to help yourself, help your children, help your students, help your family. So you can find all of this information at www.newhope.org. www.newhopecenter.net. So at this point, what I'd like to do is leave you with some hope. And the best way to do that is to invite a panel of guests up. These individuals that are walking on stage and joining me right now have been impacted by loss. They lost someone, and I will give them the opportunity to share that loss, but they are called ambassadors of hope in our organization, and it's because they've lost a loved one. They came through our programs and services, found tremendous value. Many of them will say, this saved my life, this changed my life, or this gave me my life back. So as they continue their healing and went through their grief journey and processed their loss, they now sit before you and serve as volunteers at New Hope to help embrace others who now are impacted by a loss of a loved one, and they guide them and they take the grief journey with them. It's really profound. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to them, let them introduce themselves, share their loss, and then there have been questions that have been presented and forwarded to the school that I'm going to go ahead and read off, and we'll have the panel answer them. But I encourage the guests here tonight, if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll call upon you. Or if you have questions, please reach out to New Hope or P-CCS, and Matt or myself will make sure that we get answers for you. But I'm going to leave you with letting these ambassadors of hope share. Henry, you want to start?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Henry Testa. Approximately 8 years ago, my son, Dustin, who was 27, made the unfortunate decision to end his life. Most difficult day of my life. But approximately 4 months later, I was introduced to this program, New Hope Center for Grief, and I attended an 8-week session, and it turned my life around. About 6 months after, I got into facilitating to trying to help other people on their grief journey. And I felt that I had some great experience with the counselors that helped me as well too. The New Hope program provides a new beginning for people who experience this type of loss. Thank you.
I'm Diane Rose, lived in Canton for 35 years. My husband died by suicide almost 30 years ago now. I went through quite a traumatic loss in that situation. My parents were living with us, and my mom died in the meantime. I had 3 children, ages 5, 7, and 8, who lost their dad. And it was quite an ordeal to go through. I got involved with New Hope and learned a lot about grief. Over the years, different things happened in our lives. My youngest son, who was 5 years old when his dad died, in his senior year in high school, began with anxiety and depression and was suicidal for a while. And that threw me into another difficulty, and was able to get help for him, and he recovered, and my children went on to graduate, get master's degrees, marry, and I have grandchildren now. And the most important thing to me has been the hope. With going through tragedies that don't totally go away, or you have another one come along that you don't expect, and you're trying to interpret it to children and get help for them. You have friends, especially in the suicide area, who don't understand at all that. Some don't understand depression. And after losing my husband, I went into depression myself. So the idea of hope is so important, that in the process of a grief journey, to have times of real hope that you can put your fingers on, and also, as Matt shared, specific things you can do to make that journey, to continue on in that journey, and then come to a point where the journey you've been on opens your eyes to some areas about yourself that you didn't know, and a new beginning takes place.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carla Richards. I was 9 years old when my father died, and I was told it was a car accident. Many years later, as an adult, I learned the truth that my father had died by suicide. He had been out drinking, stayed the night at a friend's house, and in the morning, the friend had found that he had hung himself. That was the most horrifying moment of my life, was to hear that news that my father took his own life. I luckily found New Hope Center for Grief Support and went through that 8-week program. And I just thought it was so wonderful to have people that understand me, that we all understand each other, we're supporting each other, we can talk openly about it. And it was just so amazing. And now I still want to be a part of that. So that's why I volunteer with New Hope.
Hi, my name's Jan Wilson. I just want to say that New Hope has really transformed my life. About 5.5 years ago, I lost my son, Matt, to a drug overdose. 4 months later, my husband died from natural causes. And then 16 months later, my daughter died due to alcoholism. I kind of just stuffed my pain because it's just so much I couldn't handle, as Matt talked about earlier. And I just knew I didn't want to spend the rest of my life living in numbness. So I did find out about New Hope through my church, and I went through the 8-week program there. It really transformed my life. I shortly after began volunteering in the office at New Hope, and eventually began facilitating and speaking. And it has, as I said, transformed my life. I feel so much more compassion now than I ever did for other people. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ed Duty. 15 years ago, on spring break, my daughter Hannah and I were in an accident, and she died in my arms. It was traumatic, extremely depressed, and didn't know what to do. My wife called our church, and the church recommended New Hope. Through my facilitator, he also had 3 daughters like I did. He was wonderful. He lost his daughter, and she was pregnant at the time, so he lost his daughter and granddaughter in the same accident. And then when New Hope was moving, they asked for volunteers to help. I volunteered my company, and the founder, Kathy, asked me to be on the board. I served 6 years on the board and then stepped off. And they called me back onto the advisory board when there were some changes. And then this last year, I became a president chair of the New Hope. So it's been a great honor. These people up here are fantastic. Our facilitators are fantastic. They truly saved my life.
My name's Emily. I'm the project coordinator at New Hope Center for Grief Support. I also lost my best friend due to a drug overdose when I was 17. And then my close friend and roommate due to suicide when I was 19. And my interest in grief, loss, and trauma is kind of what brought me to study social work and eventually intern and become a staff member at New Hope.
I've, of course, already introduced myself, but it bears saying, what a tremendous privilege it's been for the last 6+ years to work with so many of these just brave, incredible people who work to share their pain and help other people heal through their losses. And I just thank you guys so much for your courage and your vulnerability. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Matt.
Hi, my name is Kayla Ayers-Tuttle. I'm a licensed professional counselor at P-CCS Counseling along with Matt, and we work a lot with trauma and loss, doing things like EMDR and just creating a safe space where healing and growth can happen after trauma and loss.
Thank you, everyone. So the goal of this sharing opportunity is, despite the pain of loss, these individuals continue their healing by serving others in honor of their lost loved one. It's pretty powerful. So with that, I'm going to turn it over for some questions that were presented, and I'll call upon the panel to kind of guide us through them. The first question: what are actions that people in the community can do to help those who are grieving from a traumatic loss due to suicide? Second part of that question are, what are actions that people in the community should not do? Emily, would you mind taking it?
Of course. So first of all, I think this is a great question. Obviously, Matt spoke about some of the importance of grieving and mourning in community. So I think it's great that, you know, this question's being asked and that you are wanting to support those who are grieving from this tragic loss. I think when supporting someone who's experienced a loss, it's most important to really just be present and authentic when you're talking to that person. Really listen more and talk less. Obviously, helping them connect to resources can be really beneficial, like New Hope or like PCS counseling or really any therapist. I think when you're in the thick of it, you're not necessarily going to be equipped to like hunt down what's the best support group for you or how can I find a therapist. So, you know, helping people find those resources can be really helpful. Avoiding trying to cheer up people. I facilitate the teen group at New Hope, and the teens often talk about how hard it is when people say difficult things like, oh, why don't you think about the good things in life, or other things where they're just trying to cheer them up. But it's really important to instead encourage that person's vulnerability. And, you know, like Matt talked about, it's really important to express your emotions. So, you know, giving them that safe space to talk, to share, to cry, to maybe sit in silence, I think can be really helpful. Really just being present. In the teen group, we often joke about how when they share with someone that they've experienced a loss, people just like back away, which, and I've, you know, done this group many times, and that's a resounding thing that all the teens talk about. It's, you know, in our culture, talking about death is uncomfortable. And when someone has gone through something like that, you may feel like you want to avoid it, but just being there and being able to sit with them in that. My experience when I was grieving as a teenager, I did not want to talk to my parents. I actually probably never talked to my parents about the loss. They knew it had happened. I went to the funeral. But I found teens are often closer to their peers. I know that can be difficult as a parent, but I found help talking with my friends, support groups at the time, and eventually seeing a therapist. You know, my parents just needed to know that I was talking to somebody, which I think is helpful, even if that person is not you. And eventually, as a community, I think it can be really powerful to do things in memory of the person that has been lost. I know many people at New Hope have done different things, memorial gardens, things like that, that can be really healing for those people who've experienced the loss when they are ready for it. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you, Emily. All right, the next question. When a sudden death or death due to suicide occurs, people sometimes feel guilty and wonder if they should have seen something that they missed. What causes this and how does someone overcome it? Henry and Diane?
It is completely natural to feel guilty over a sudden death or death due to suicide, even though it was not your fault. If you're feeling like this, one must come to acknowledge that the only person truly responsible was the person who took his or her life. Still, we must explore any possible feelings of guilt in order to move beyond those feelings. Likewise, it is also normal and natural for one to want to understand why the person we love took his or her life. However, we must also accept that we may never fully understand why.
Thank you, Henry. Diane?
One of the things that has helped me in that area early on, I would go back over and over again. What did I do? What didn't I do? What didn't I see? Blaming myself, which is not is not rational. But one thing I learned was that to talk to my mind instead of letting my mind talk to me. If I go over something and come to a conclusion, then when it comes up again, I need to say to myself, we went over this before. That's not an issue that's dealt with. So I'm telling myself to not get in a blame routine that's not rational, that's not helpful, and that in the long run stalls the grief journey.
Thank you, Diane. I lost a loved one and I'm struggling with how to talk about it. What advice can you give me? Carla, would you?
Yes, of course, it is very hard to talk about it. I think for me, the best thing that I found is I found people that I could trust. Ed had mentioned, or I'm sorry, Emily had mentioned that people will back away when you talk about death. That's not the person that you want to talk to. You want to find the people that are willing to sit and listen and sympathize with you and take the time to understand you. Those are the people you can trust, and those are the people that you should go and talk to. When I was a child, I had adults in my life that did not want to talk about it. Those are not the people that I trust even today. It's very important to me to be truthful, to be honest, to be forthcoming. And those are the people you need to, connect with.
Thank you. Next question. Some friends of mine recently lost a child. They are isolating themselves and won't connect with me. I've encouraged them to get out and do something to get their mind off their loss. What else can I do to help them? Jan and Ed, would you answer this?
First of all, expect there to be some time where they really just are feeling their grief and the pain, which they need to do. So they may not want to be connecting with friends. But the best thing you can do is just not only tell them I'm here for you, because, let me know if you need something. People will say, let me know if I can help you. That person is likely not going to reach out to you and ask you to come over and cut their grass or bring a meal. So just do it. Just reach out yourself and do something for them, whether it be clean their house or bring meals or set up a carpool for kids or whatever you need to do. And the other thing is to just listen and don't give advice, or don't try to give advice or mentor them, just listen to them.
There's an old saying called shivas. Sometimes you just go over there and sit and do nothing. And find that safe person, like we've all talked about. And I think why New Hope works, and it's worked for over 20 years, is we're in that group with similar losses. And, if you're in a group, if you've lost a child, you want to hear about someone that lost a grandmother. So that's what makes it work. Listening in a group, it's a ship that nobody wants to be on, but you're in that ship. So it's got a sail. Another thing is just kind of be on the offense as the calendar year goes around. Those holidays, those special days, date of birth, date of death, even the first and last day of school, those are tough days. So make sure you let that person know that you're there for them.
Thank you. All right, Matt, this one's for you. You ready? Is suicide contagious? What can be done to prevent it? And does depression increase the risk of suicide?
So when an event like this happens in a community, fear, of course, is going to be an initial response. Emily and I were talking earlier today. I would say categorically, suicide is not contagious. Okay? What I would say is that we know that people who are depressed or who are dealing with traumatic loss, those are risk factors for additional mental health issues and trauma, as I discussed. Now, the issue is, so is all of the other risk factors that, pressure to perform at school, challenges with friends, challenges communicating with parents. So we love to focus on this big thing right in our face because it's, we can grab onto it. But the reality is, mental health and trauma are these variety of complicated factors that all come together to form that pain. So people who are already dealing with mental health issues tend to be triggered by a traumatic loss when they can't process through that pain because they can't process through their pain. And in those cases, again, prevention's always best, right? And the best we can, get them some help, get them some support. If they don't, try to get them to talk to a therapist. If they don't want to talk to a therapist, have them talk to, a teen grief support group, right? Where there are other kids who are dealing with this kind of stuff. A lot of people won't go, some kids, the ones that won't go to therapy are more likely to talk with their peers. The truth is that if we can wade into the complicated soup of mental health, most of the time, the reality is a child will most benefit from, yes, them going to therapy, but their parents going to therapy. Their parents trying to find out from a professional, what can I do? What do I need to learn? What am I missing? Because I can only be, or Kayla can only be with your kid an hour a week at max, right? But you're with your kid hours and hours a week at max. And if you can do your healing, you can bring that into the lives of your children. So I understand the response of being scared or wanting to control the situation or wanting to prevent something else from happening. Redirect that on, okay, what do I need to learn? What work do I need to do? And how can I address the already existing mental health issues within my life, my child's life, and community that we exist in?
Thank you, Matt. Kayla, this one's for you. What role does social media play in mental health?
Social media is kind of like a double-edged sword, I think, when it comes to mental health. I think it's provided a lot of great things. I think it's normalized a lot of mental health concerns and support groups and built community around mental health. But I also think there's a lot of things like not measuring up and comparison and am I ever going to be good enough? And do I have likes and followers and all these very superficial things? And sometimes the deeper things are missed. I think about like dopamine. So one of the like pleasure chemicals, like every time you check your phone or you get a like, it's like this little ping, but it goes away really quickly. And what you're really looking for more is like oxytocin, like the connection chemical of like loving, caring support of people around you. So, and sometimes social media can provide that for you in some degree, but is it really like the deep, meaningful connection that you're looking for?
Thank you. I'm going to come back with another question right now. What should you do if someone is posting about harmful behavior to themselves or others on social media? Do you call 911? What if you aren't sure if it is real? What do you do if a friend shared with you that they have thoughts about harming themselves but asked you not to tell an adult?
I think we keep kind of touching on it, but just normalizing talking about it and like providing space to be vulnerable. I think we kind of have this culture where we launch into like defense action protocols of like, there's something that could be potentially harmful. And we go into like, let's do all the safety things. And I'm not saying that that's not always needed, but they need to be referred to psychiatric services or police services or something like that. But I think we often miss the why of like what led up to this. It's like we're jumping into action without really, what they really need is the connection and the support. And if they don't feel comfortable going to adults, it's probably that there's been this kind of cycle of not getting their needs met emotionally. So having that conversation of who do you trust? Like it doesn't have to be the school counselor or like a parent. It could be like your coach, like on a sports team of like, who do you feel comfortable talking to? Like, do you feel safe enough to go to this person? And I will go with you every step of the way, like providing all these options of things that we can do. And I'll be there with you. And it, I think, is the most important part.
Okay. Would you advise for kids if a friend has disclosed and they don't know how to handle the situation to seek out an adult?
I would. I would try to talk to them first if possible, but I think safety wise, we always want to be safer rather than not know what's going on. So, and having that conversation of, it's kind of like when a child is getting abused and you have to make a CPS call and it's like this, some action needs to happen, and having that conversation of, this isn't a punishment, it's not a consequence of what's going on. Like, I really want to connect you with services and anything that looks like. So if it is a safety concern, getting someone involved, whether it's a mental health provider or depending on the severity, or getting consult with your counselors, your school counselors, school social workers. I mean, they're everywhere in the community. So find someone who's knowledgeable in the field to connect with.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, why does mental health have such a negative stigma attached to it? How can we as a community support mental health the same way we do physical health and help others see that there isn't anything wrong with getting support? Emily.
Again, I love this question. I know Matt talked about this a little bit already, but first of all, stigma often comes from past misinformation and from when we didn't understand how mental health and mental illness worked or where it came from, along with often inaccurate and misleading media representations. I think, as Matt said, it starts with each and every one of us. I joke in the team group, and they don't think I'm funny, that if I could be like Oprah, she's like, you get a car, you get a car. I would be like, you get a therapist, you get a therapist, to everybody. I've seen a therapist at times in my life when I was struggling, and while that was helpful, seeing a therapist now at a time in my life when I am not struggling has been life-changing. And I talk to my friends about the fact I see a therapist. If you don't want to see a therapist, join a support group. It could be a support group about parenting, about meditation, about grief, and then talk about it. Share that you're doing it with your friends, with your close family, with the people in your immediate community. Unfortunately, stigma takes a long time to go away, and we can't change the world all at once as much as we wish we could. But it's just important to educate yourself about mental health so that you can speak up with when people are maybe saying things that are insensitive, using inappropriate language regarding mental health, or spreading misinformation. Again, I just think that you have to start small, and that every single person would benefit from support, therapy. And then once you take that step, you're able to spread that further and further into your community and into hopefully eventually the United States and globally, like Matt said.
Thank you, Emily. So I want to ask if anybody in the audience has any questions that they'd like to ask of anyone on the panel. Anyone? Any staff? Okay. With that, I'm going to let everybody have the rest of their evening back. But I hope today the individuals up on stage and the organization New Hope can be a resource for our community. I hope that you found some hope in taking conversations home with your families. Know that it takes a village to raise them, and navigating grief, trauma, and loss is on all of us. It's individual, it's our families, it's our community. So reach out and get support. Do it for your children. Lead by example so they know that it's okay. And hopefully we can come together as a community and thrive and find hope, healing, and new beginnings. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panel to give final thoughts, and we're going to say goodnight. Thank you very much to Canton High School for having us. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here and to share. Henry, you want to start?
Well, thank you for giving us the opportunity to share. You're all in our prayers, and we'll get through this together.
Diane, you want to final thoughts?
I'm thinking how very difficult this is to think about and talk about, and the pain that each of us has. The pandemic has just multiplied it by 1,000%. And it's a hard thing. And I feel sad for the parents and the families who have lost someone recently to suicide. And I think with the idea of mental illness, that that talking about it with people, I know once I became depressed and going through anxiety and on medication and et cetera, I talked to people about it, whether they wanted to hear it or not, because I wanted them to be educated. And in the process, I found there were quite a few other people that were either in the process or needed to see a therapist. So I look at it as one of my missions for the rest of my life, to offer hope to people by talking about things that we don't talk about, and offering suggestions and resources. There's so many resources available.
Thank you. Carla?
Kind of piggybacking off of what Diane said, it is best, in my opinion, it is good to talk about it openly. You don't know who that next person is that's also hurting. And then by them hearing you talk about it, that helps them to open up. It lets them know that you are a person that they can come to if they need. So I'm very proud of everyone who showed up today. I know this is it's not a very fun place to be, but thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jan.
I just want to say too, thank you for coming, and the most important thing is to love your children and take care of them, but know that you can't put them in a box either. So it's a hard mix of things.
Thank you.
Thank you for letting us come tonight, and I'm so proud of you for guys being here tonight. It's the first step, you know. We're here for you. It's free. Come look us up, or anyone else. Like Matt says, we don't care who you look up. Just get some help, and remember, the enemy loves it when you're alone. So,
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you guys for having us. And, like Ed kind of said, it starts here. So thank you for coming. Share this video with your friends. Talk about what you heard tonight with your friends. That can help to reduce the stigma of mental health. And don't be afraid to just call Me Hope if you have questions for us, or if you don't know where to start. We can help you get plugged into a program, a support group, a local therapist. We're happy to help provide resources. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you, Matt.
I could go on and on, but the thing I did not share that I usually do, when I lost my friend Aaron, this may not be helpful for everybody, but it was helpful for me, was the grief therapist said, you know, who was she and what did she teach you? And how can you take those things that she taught you and include them in who you are? And when we do that, that person lives on through us and with us, and we're able to bring that piece of them into the world. And, so those of us who are dealing with these difficult losses, if we can take those pieces of the people that we've lost and we love and embody them and live them out, they're with us and they're still touching other people just like they touched us. Thank you all for being willing to sit with your pain tonight, and know that, again, everybody is here to love and support you through the pain you're dealing with. You are not alone.
Thank you, Matt. Kayla?
Thank you so much for having us. I feel like Matt's a tough act to follow to wrap up things. So I don't know if I should be sitting here, but I just want to say that I feel like if we can move away from the avoidance kind of strategies with mental health and just normalize talking about it. Mental health doesn't just happen in a therapy room. It's the, how are you? We don't have to say good and move on. Like, you don't have to launch into everything, but just be honest. Like, it's not great, but things are moving into place. Or I think you can normalize some of those conversations that happens in some of these small moments, even with your kids at the dinner table. Not just how was your day? Good, move on. Like, what was the best and worst part of your day? When did you feel sad? When did you feel happy? Like, using some of this language, I think, can help break the stigma as well.
Thank you. And again, thank you everyone for being here. And may you reach out and find hope, healing, and new beginnings amongst the pain that we're all grieving. So good night, and we are here for you.